All right, I am recording. I love it when he double checks my work. My name is Greg Boggs. I'm an engineering manager for a company called Hotshot. I've done Drupal development for many years. I was very excited when I learned about some of the features that Drupal 8 was going to have. And my favorite feature was configuration management in Drupal core, storing configuration in the file system. I was ecstatic. I jumped on the Drupal 8 excited train 5 years ago, and I just couldn't wait until every website I had used this tool, config in the file system. I was very excited. For those of you familiar with the Drupal development process, it didn't quite turn out like we had hoped. There were some compromises made, and I have a solution to a couple of them. My goal for the talk is to convince you to change the workflow that you might already be using or that you might start using if you build Drupal 8 websites. Almost everyone in the community does not use this workflow. As far as I know, there are 3 Drupal agencies that use it. They love it. They say thank you. My goal is to get more of us on board with using the workflow. So before I get started and kind of dive into some basics, I want to do a quick poll because I have really 2 options for this talk, kind of based on the experience level in the audience. And I really encourage you, if you're new, please do raise your hand. So my first question is, who considers themselves new to configuration in Drupal 8? You haven't used it too much, you know a little bit about it, but if I go over some basics, you're going to find that useful. Who currently has already used Config Suite in a Drupal 8 site? Oh, good. And who considers themselves like someone who knows the configuration system well enough and you got it down, you can use it, it's good? Okay. So based on the answers, I'm going to do a little bit of introduction. It's going to be about 5 to 7 minutes, kind of the basics. And then we'll get into workflows. After workflows, I'll talk about my preferred workflow. I'll try to convince you that my way is the best way and that everyone else is wrong. After we do that, I'll admit to some drawbacks to my method, and we'll talk about merging configuration to production. We'll wrap up with questions. So, what is configuration? You can read the slide, but my take on configuration is that configuration is the settings required to control your Drupal website that are not content. So, the body field on a page, on a blog post, that's content. The site name of your website, that's configuration. And the big difference between the two is how they are stored. Content is stored in tables for content, in node tables, in node revision tables. Content works with views. Content's meant to be displayed on the website for people to read. The configuration is stored in the database in a special table where all of the configuration goes into a single configuration table. So how does configuration work in Drupal? We make configuration changes in forms. Either you set the site name in the configuration of your Drupal site, or you place a block in Block UI, or you build a view with Drupal views and you produce configuration. You create fields, those fields make database tables, and that's all stored in the configuration table. But here's the thing, we want to save our work with configuration. So first we make that configuration in the database, and then we export our work from the database into text files. Once we have that in text files, we save our work, usually with Git. Some people use SFTP, but we save our work to Git. We go through a deployment process to get that work to production. And then if you're sharing configuration between 2 sites or deploying to a site that's a little bit different than the one that you've got on your local laptop, you're going to have to do one little step where you fix the UUID in that configuration so that it matches the site you're deploying it to. There's several different ways to do that. And then finally, you go to that production site and you import the configuration. The same idea in picture form. You start with either your local or a development server. You create that configuration, and then you run a command to export that configuration, which creates config.yaml files. You send those files to a Git repository, saving your work. You push it up. Then you go to your remote server, production, or maybe your dev server out on a hosting company, and you do a Git pull or a deployment process to get your configuration there. But once it's there on the server, it's just sitting around in the file system, and our configuration lives in the database. So then we have to import that configuration from those YAML files into that configuration table. And at that point, that configuration is active in your Drupal site. So configuration is YAML files, right? Well, configuration is YAML files that have been stored in a database table. And the default storage for Drupal 8 is that database storage. So these YAML configuration files, while they exactly match what's in your database, they don't actually drive the configuration of your Drupal site. They're a copy of all of the settings in your Drupal website. Early in the Drupal 8 process, we started with file-based configuration storage, and that has been deprecated. So we're no longer going to be supporting file-based configuration in Drupal 9, and our only option for storage is database storage. But we want to get our files in and out of Git all day long, over and over again. And then the key piece here is that we have two folders for configuration, or two places to store configuration. The sync folder, that's the place where you store your exported configuration or your configuration about to be imported, and your active configuration, which is the configuration table in your database. Now there's some drawbacks to this. Big drawback is now your configuration is stored in the database. Configuration in the database is very difficult to edit because it's in a database table. You'd have to use a SQL editor to change it. It's very difficult to share that database between two developers. You could do a little SQL dump of your table and give that to another developer, but that gets really clunky. What if they want just a little bit of your configuration and not your whole table? It's also difficult to then reuse that configuration on another website. So you build some configuration, you put together a slideshow and a blog, and you just want to put it on a new website. It's all in that database table. It is difficult to work with. And the final piece here is a configuration must go through the configuration import step. It's the most important step in the configuration management process, and if you don't run a configuration import, you'll end up with an incomplete database, or a database that does not match your code in your Drupal website. You'll get all sorts of errors about file table storage is missing and very confusing stuff. And this can come up if you do use that deprecated file storage system and you just skip the import step. And you'll be missing tables, or you'll have the old tables, and that import step is really key requirement to that Drupal 8 configuration management process. The reason it's so important is because in Drupal, configuration is responsible for updating your database schema. Database schema is a fancy word to say the structure of your tables and the way the data is stored in Drupal. And the configuration system in Drupal is what actually generates your database. Deletes database tables, that sort of thing, modifies them when they need to change. And those edits, they're done in that import step. They're not done when you create the configuration or export the configuration. It's only when you import the configuration. So if you read that configuration without importing it first, your Drupal site's very broken and you're off track. So we've got some goals here. We want to keep our configuration in code. We always want our configuration to be in sync with the database. We never want the code and the database config to be out of sync. We don't want last week's code with this week's configuration or vice versa. If we're working in a complex team and we're doing Git and we're branching and we're switching back and forth between versions of the project, we want to make sure we're always in sync between configuration and code. We want to be able to deploy that configuration from our laptop to development to production across multiple environments. We want to be able to merge our configuration into the production site because lots of people with Drupal sites modify their configuration in production. So when we're all done, we want to tie everything together. And then we want to share that configuration with our coworkers or our friends. It's an open source community. You make something cool, you want to give to other people. So we've got 3 options for our workflow. The first option is the one built into Drupal itself, It's a little web interface with a few screens that allow you to export configuration and import configuration. And then when you import configuration, it will allow you to merge changes in. And then the second way is Drush. Drush is a command line tool. It comes with commands that operate configuration. You can import, you can edit, you can export. The last way is my way. It's called Config Suite, and the short version of Config Suite is that Config Suite automates the process that you're using Drush to do manually. But before we go too far, demo time. Oh, I have to come out of there. So for this demo, I have a little environment set up on Pantheon. If you're not familiar with Pantheon, they're in the exhibit hall. You should talk to them. They come with multiple environments. They've got a dev environment, a test environment, a live environment, and it makes it really easy for me to set up a demo of a Drupal site. So here I'm on the dev environment on the Pantheon site. Can everybody see that okay? Sort of. Let's see if I can zoom in with Windows somehow. Oh, now I can't see it. Let me finish navigating and then I'll zoom in.
Maybe I'll just Control plus the font.
Okay, we're going to go small just so I can navigate it. This is the built-in configuration synchronization screen in Drupal. If you install Drupal out of the box, you get this included with Drupal. And this was Drupal core team's idea in how we might manage our configuration when we're building websites. The screen comes with 3 screens: synchronize, import, and export. If you make changes and you push those to the server but they're not installed yet, they show up in synchronize. If you want to import configuration, you can upload a zip file, or a tar.gz file it's called, and you upload that here and then you press upload and that will install it in a Drupal site. The important screen here that some developers use is called single item. So if you just want to fix one little thing on your Drupal site, maybe you got a block, you just got to get in there, you can use this little tab to put in one configuration file. And then the last one is the export tab. The export tab will allow you to download the configuration as that zip file that you could then upload in your website. So if you're a non-technical person, but you've got your 2 sites, you don't want to use Git, you don't want to have command line tools, you can export from the UI, and you can import from the UI in your website. The tool is very robust, it very rarely breaks, and it has a lot of error checking to prevent you from making mistakes. The difficulty is it's entirely manual. You're clicking a bunch of screens, downloading files, uploading files, and if you're working on a big website, you're going to have to do this many, 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 many times. So, back to present mode. The Drush way. So Drush, if you don't know, it's a command line tool for Drupal that allows you to operate your Drupal website. It gives us some shortcut commands to do what that UI was doing. So we can run a fancy command here, and this first one says, export my configuration from my local site and put it into my sync folder in my local file system. That'll give you a copy of the configuration as files. Then you can use your git commands there to add those files, commit those files, and push those files. So, Drush export, git push, git commit, git add, git commit, git push, and then the final step, after we deploy that code to our website, we have to go to that website or use Drush to operate that website to import that configuration. Having it on the server isn't enough. We have to get it in the database on that server. So I said we were going to automate this. I wrote a module called Config Suite, and what Config Suite does is it automates the process that you run with the Drush command. So you got a Drush command for configuration import. Well, Config Suite runs configuration imports for you when you change your staging folder. So if you do a deploy, Config Suite's going to notice that you've changed your config files and import that config into the site. If you make a configuration change, you edit a view, you change the site name, config suite's going to see that you've done that and automatically export that change that you've just made to your file system. No longer do you even need the drush commands to run your imports and your exports. And then the final thing that it does is it's making sure that you can then reuse that configuration on another site, even if it's not the same database as yours, because I want this to be all automatic and there should be no hiccup where it breaks. And the whole goal of this module is really to save yourself from having to type this command hundreds or thousands of times as you work on a large project over the course of many weeks. But the other piece to this is it's really making sure that we're keeping the code and the configuration in sync, because if you change branches or add your coworkers' work to your work, you really want to make sure your configuration's in sync with that code, so as you make new configuration, everything's synced up and nothing's out of sync. So what happens if you don't have this module? Even if you're an expert, you know exactly how drush works, you've used it 50, 100 times, 1,000 times. You'll check out your coworkers' work, you'll review their work, and you'll say, oh, look, I need a little more work here, and you fix a view or whatever, and then you export it. But if you forgot to run that import as soon as you checked out their work, your copy of the configuration is now out of sync with what they intended you to have, and you end up destroying their work and losing it, and then you have to go back and get, and there's a lot of communication that happens when you've accidentally deleted your coworker's configuration because you forgot to import. And so what most people in most agencies do is they say, oh, well, never ever forget to export, never ever forget to import, always, always, always type that command every single time you type change branches. Okay. Now we are ready to demo. So Pantheon has a really interesting feature called SFTP mode. And what that does is it allows you to write to the file system on your dev server and make changes without doing any Git or any command line, any developer tools. You can just upload files and change it. But what it also allows us to do is make changes with Drupal itself. So on this Drupal demo site, I have installed Config Suite. Config Suite comes with two options: automatically import configuration when it changes, and automatically export configuration when you make a change. So I'm going to go over here, go to the site name, and I'm going to change it to Config Suite Works. And I'm going to hit save. It says your configuration options have been saved. The workflow everyone uses now requires them to do a drush export of that configuration from a Pantheon dev site to their local file system. So before they do that, they'd have to download the database or do something to get that configuration out of their Pantheon dev site so that they could export it into a file system, or they could set up drush to talk to remote Pantheon things. It's not impossible to do, but it is a little bit complicated, and if you're not super comfortable with command line, just kind of the idea of getting your configuration out of this Pantheon dev site into your code so that you can then deploy it through the rest of the process is difficult. But with Config Suite on, you can see here back on the Pantheon tab, Pantheon says one file is ready to be committed to dev. So Pantheon has allowed me to export that configuration automatically to my sync folder. I can say edit site name to works, commit that change. It's now doing a commit for me in the background. I don't have to know how git works. Just makes a git commit with my one configuration change. That will take a little bit. And once that's done, we can go over to the test site, and it should have our configuration waiting for us. So over here, I played with it a couple of times before the demo because I really didn't want it to work, or didn't want it to break. I did want it to work. Change site name to works. Now we're going to use the Pantheon tools to deploy our configuration to test. If you're using the regular drush tools, you now have to use drush to go to the test server and tell the test server, please import this code into your database. And if you forget to do that, you've done your deploy, you've got all your config up there, but it's not imported yet. The test site's not using it. So if you close your ticket and you say, I'm all done, please test my work, the tester's going to look at your work and go, there's no site name change, it's still the same. Okay. Now we're going to go over to the test site. Probably can't see it, but the URL up there says test. and I'm just going to refresh the test site. Config suite works. So I didn't run an export process. I didn't run an import process. I just changed the website, saved my work, deployed my work to test, and test used it. I think everyone should do this. I think we should use it as just part of our workflow. In fact, when I was working at a wonderful agency called ThinkShout, I enabled this module on a couple of our sites, and several of my coworkers who were new to Drupal 8 because it had just come out were using my website, and Drupal 8 was exporting their configuration and they're working away, and they just thought that's how Drupal 8 worked because it made sense. So there are some drawbacks. So one of the things that Drush tool lets you do is if you're manually merging in your configuration and importing it and exporting it, every time you go to import that configuration, you're doing it manually. So you can actually use Drush to say, hey, what's my configuration look like? Am I about to merge things? And it'll say, oh, you're about to destroy some configuration. Are you sure you want to do that? And so some developers kind of use that command line workflow as kind of a safety net. So rather than making sure their configuration is correct and ready to deploy, they're relying on Drush to give them like a safety net and a warning system. If you're doing an automated configuration import and export, you no longer have that step with Drush where you can check all of your work. So you have to check your work before you deploy. The next thing is there's no way to not export your work. This comes up if you've got a little dev site and you're testing around and you make a view and you make a blog and you fiddle with the roles and give yourself admin permissions. As you're doing that with Config Suite turned on, it's carefully exporting all of your work one change at a time as you make them, so that when you go to when you're going to your Git tool, Git's going to show all of these config file changes that you just made because you made them. And since you're not relying on Drush to export them, you don't have an easy way to just not export code. Everything always gets exported. So what that means is either you be a little more diligent when creating configuration as you work in your local site, or you just learn how to throw away your changes in whatever tool you're using. If you're using Git, you can check out the old config from the repo, you can do a reset, you can selectively commit things so that you're not committing the config you don't want. But again, you don't have that command line step where you're having a manual step that can prevent you from producing that configuration. You always get it. Okay, so I love configuration workflow. I've produced a whole talk on it. I've written an entire module on it. I have read almost every blog post that people have written about managing configuration in Drupal 8 and workflows. And what every single blog post skips is the most important step. How do you merge your configuration to production? And I use the word merge on purpose because most Drupal 8 websites allow you to change configuration directly in production. The people who are changing that configuration, maybe they're dragging and dropping blocks, maybe they're changing the site name, maybe they're changing the site email to their personal email or their work email, and they hit save, and Drupal's happily making those changes in the database. So as a developer, you come along, you've done the work to fix their site, do a feature request, and you're ready to import it. Well, the Drupal 8 configuration system is all or nothing. If you import your work, you're going to destroy what's in production unless it's already part of your work. So there's a few ways to deal with this problem. One way is to use Drush and very carefully stop yourself from merging in configuration if there's open stuff in production that you forgot to save. Another way is that you can just block people from making changes in production. There's a module called config read only, and what that does is it allows you to set production configuration to read-only mode. And so if a site administrator goes to a site in production and tries to make a view, the button is actually grayed out. If they try to save the site name, it's grayed out, and they cannot save a new site name, and they're like, oh, I can't. And they'll email you and complain about the bug, the button's grayed out, and you'll be like, oh, no, switch over to your dev site and make the change in the dev site. And then it'll get that little FTP message, they can commit their work, press test, deploy to test, deploy to live, and it'll import for them when they load the page. But it does stop them from being able to just change configuration in production. Configuration has to go from development, to test, to live. That's the way I like to do it, but a lot of people who are very used to the current Drupal 8 workflow are just used to building views and editing blocks. And what do you mean I can't change the site name? I could do that in Drupal 7. So there's another option. There's a module called config ignore. And what config ignore does is it basically just removes certain types of config from the configuration management synchronization process. So one thing that people would commonly ignore is block config, because you know that your content editors are constantly editing blocks and dragging and dropping them. So if you ignore blocks and only blocks, well, you can no longer easily deploy blocks as a programmer, but you'll also not lose any of that block work that the content editors have been doing. And that's actually a reasonable solution for a lot of projects, especially if they're not extremely complex sites, because most of the merge problems with production are blocks. And so by ignoring the one really bad problem, most of the time you're fine. A third method is called config tools, and the author of config tools is here, and I think he explained that it was a dare on whether or not it could be done, and he did it. I might have not paraphrased that story as well as he told it, but you should ask him. Config tools will automatically make a git commit to a repository when you edit configuration. So as your site builder or your content editor is in there willy-nilly changing things in production, Drupal is committing all of their work to a repository that you've set up for their work to go to. So as they're editing their Drupal site name, Drupal's making a commit to a repository. So as a developer, you've built something, you need all of their work merged into your work. Well, it's in the repository that Drupal's been putting it in for you, so you can then merge their production work into your work and then deploy it all together. The fourth way, if you don't have any of those three ways set up and you've got a bunch of stuff in production and you just need to get this live, what a lot of people do is they go into production and they download the database. They copy the entire database to their laptop, they import the database in their laptop, and then they run drush commands to export the configuration from production, and then they merge that into their configuration and hope everything is exactly right, because if you do the merge wrong, merges are really difficult, but if you press the wrong arrow, you're accidentally deleting the production stuff. It's difficult, but that's the workflow most people are using. So there's a drush command called drush cpoll or config poll, and what that does is that will take the configuration from production and export it to your local system in one command. And that allows you to skip the database export, installing the database locally, so it makes the whole process a little bit easier. But I still put that method at the bottom because I would really, really like to avoid that if at all possible. Simply because merging that production configuration into your work after you get it is a difficult task. You have to very carefully read the configuration files. You have to understand which ones are yours, which ones are in production, which ones you need to keep. It's the difficult thing to do. That step right there can often make a production deploy for Drupal take 20 minutes, 40 minutes, depends on how fast you are with Git merges. If you're a wizard, you can probably do it in 10 minutes, no big deal. If you're new to Git and you're not super comfortable with merging, you might spend an hour merging all those production things in and not be so confident that it's all right. So I really encourage you to look into these first three methods. I think with any more expensive software as a service hosting company like Pantheon or Acquia, you can rely on their tool set and kind of FTP mode for even non-technical users to stick to that dev test live mode. And if they want to make those configuration changes, just get them into FTP mode and help them do it. I have yet to use config tools in a live production website just because it's a little wild, I think. But I do know the module works very well. So before you ask me questions, I have one question. Have I convinced any of you to give it a try?
One of us.
Huzzah!
Awesome.
I really want to see that, so I said yes.
Question.
Yeah.
So does that require SFTP mode to be enabled, and basically is only allowed in like templates?
The primary use case for Config Suite is if you're doing local development.
Oh.
So if you have a local copy of your Drupal site, you're more of a technical developer, you've got your whole stack set up on your laptop, it's just going to work. There's no fancy modes or anything. It's just exporting your configuration for you as you change it.
Got
The
it.
reason I do the demo for Pantheon is because not everyone has a LAMP stack set up on their laptop, so the whole process of exporting from a dev server on Pantheon is more difficult for them.
But if you would like to track production or dev configuration on dev site in Git,
Yes.
Pantheon is our only option right now because of that.
It will also work on Acquia.
Oh,
And
with live dev enabled.
yeah, and then I believe it will work on Amaze.io. I'm not sure if it works on Platform SH or not.
Gotcha.
But the basic idea is you need a web server where the server has permission to write to the sync file folder.
Yeah, I get it.
Can you just have it running locally and?
Absolutely. So I mentioned one of the agencies that use it is ThinkShout, and I believe they only use it locally on their own laptops, and they only use the export feature. They don't use the import feature. They do the imports by hand because those are very important and they want to check them. So they use the export on their laptops when they're working away, they're just doing development, and it's not being deployed directly to the server, and that's just on their laptops, kind of like the devel module for Drupal.
Can you also use it in conjunction with like config ignore, config split?
Yes, it works with all of the popular configuration modules as far as I know.
So can we use git ignore instead of config ignore?
Yes, you can do that too.
I just wanted to ask, are you posting the slides?
Yes, I'm going to post them to my talk as soon as I sit down and have a minute to upload them. I believe you were next. Yeah.
I guess I'm still a little skeptical for the reason that you mentioned before. I like to see feedback when I'm deploying, and so I'm just wondering about, is there any feedback at all in logging? What if you have a failed import or something?
Mm-hmm.
You just have no idea except going to the site and checking. That would be helpful.
Do you currently use Get when you do development?
Yeah.
So with config suite turned on, you're going to be merging your configuration with Get. So where you will get into trouble is if you never export the configuration from production.
I guess, yeah, well, so I'm also someone who locks down config on production. That just is not something I'm ever going to be merging with my own configuration change. I wouldn't merge configuration changes ever.
Yeah, so if you're locking down production config, then your imports are not going to break. However, if you're concerned about it and you want to be more careful about it, especially the first time you try the module, or for the first year you use the module, that's why I very carefully made each one an optional feature. And if it's a little too aggressive for you and you do want that manual review step, then you can just uncheck automatic imports and you can run your imports manually. Yep.
It's probably an annoying question, but why'd you name it config suite instead of something like config sync or?
Well, right now it does 3 things. I'm soon going to be merging it with config tools, I think. So I'm going to be doing the 2 things that config tools does, and then I'm going to be doing 5 different things. So I named it config suite, like display suite, except for config.
Gotcha. So like lots of okay.
And I think you were next.
Can you use config ignore and the one that blocks config changes on production? Can you use those
Config
together?
read only? Yes,
Yeah.
you can use config read only and config ignore in conjunction, but you probably wouldn't need config ignore if you're using config read only, because the big use case for config ignore is they are changing config in production and you want to ignore that configuration that they're using. Having said that, there's probably more advanced uses for config ignore that I don't know, and I think he was next and then you. So if you're letting your content people edit configuration directly in production, and you import your new configuration into production, you're going to replace what's in production with your new configuration. You have a potential, if you produced damaged or incomplete configuration, if you made a serious mistake manually editing the files, your import might fail. And then what's going to happen is that Drupal's going to try to import the configuration when you load the page. And then it's going to fail, and your configuration won't change. So you edit your site name, and your site name doesn't change. And you're like, what happened? It was supposed to change.
So your consequences
Yeah, and it's actually exactly the same consequences that you have when running drush config import.
Sure.
Because I'm using literally the same code, I'm just running it for you.
So I haven't really ever had any problems with config import. Most of it was here, especially in production.
Yeah.
Because like there's not a lot of feedback about what happens then.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, like, are you going to host your site? Is it going to just be like a page?
It's very unlikely. I think the most likely thing that will happen is that the import just will not succeed,
It's just going to say, sorry, I couldn't do that.
and then not do it.
Just, okay.
Yeah.
Good. Thanks.
So you could use config ignore and config read only at the same time, because config read only has a hook for whitelisting. So anything you put in config ignore, you would also put in the whitelist, so that they can
Nice.
still update their site in some specific ways, but everything else they will.
I like it. I'm actually going to have to set that up.
Can you tell me how workflows might change with the config 2.0 initiative?
The workflow is not changing with the config 2.0 initiative, but some things are getting smoother. So one of the things that's getting smoother, for example, is that config installer, which is one way that people reuse other people's configuration, is now part of Drupal core. So if you used to use the config installer module to reuse other people's configuration on install, you can now do that as part of core. So that's kind of a workflow thing, but they're not changing the workflow that everybody's using with drush export import. Yeah.
Question. So since you're dealing with imports of partial configs, and you talked about config system being a monolithic all or nothing, have you seen any problems with first dependencies? Second, how are you handling deletes? For example, drush import partial would not do deletes for you. Are you handling that?
So if you're using config suite to automatically import, there's no option for partial import. So I don't have a flag for drush config import partial.
So it's like all.
But that would be super easy to add.
I don't want it.
So if you have a workflow where you're using that drush import partial command, we could simply add another checkbox for do drush import partial and kind of explain for.
No, I don't want it. I wanted to clarify if you are doing the partial or you're doing the full.
I'm doing a full import, yeah. Great. Anybody else have questions? All right. Thanks for your time, everybody.